this is Danny here, and today we're going to be going over Python Fundamentals Part 1. So, if you haven't already downloaded Python, it's a prerequisite to this video, so make sure you go download it now. I'll include the link to Python in my description, so you can go down there and check for the download. So let's get started with it. So first things first, what you're gonna want to do is open your IDE. So this is just a development environment for you. You can use your default Python IDLE. However, I am using Visual Studio Code for this just because of its added utility, and I can vouch for it. It is a reputable software. So if you're looking for an IDE to switch to and you're not sure which one, make sure you go and download Visual Studio Code. Trust me, it's worth it. Okay, let's get straight into this. So let's start with creating your first script. So what you're gonna want to do is create a new file here and set its programming language to Python. And save that, and I'm just gonna call this one lesson1.py. I don't really need the .py. So lesson1.py. Let's just start with the first program. So the first program I like to tell everyone to start off with is print hello world. Yes, the print hello world. So yep, that's your first function, guys. If you want to know how to run it in Visual Studio Code, you can simply just run it from your text editor. However, if you're not working on Visual Studio Code, what you'll want to do is go to your file's path directory. You can search up other videos on how to do that, but just a quick overview: use cd ... to go back a directory, and cd and then file name to go forward the directory. So now that I'm in the directory of my file here, I can simply do Python 3 to make reference to the fact that we want to run some Python code, and then our file name, which is lesson1.py, my bad. So when we run that, we'll actually get that hello world output. So now that we know our code's running, let's look over what this code actually does. Our print function here, and a function is something that just runs a piece of code, simply outputs to the terminal what is inside of its brackets. And in this case, it's just a string saying hello world. It's pretty straightforward. It should become more clear as I go through these Python fundamentals, so stay tuned. So first thing I want to talk about is Python keywords. Now, this doesn't really have to do anything with the fundamentals of programming. However, it's just a good thing to understand. So if you've already done any coding and you're still a basic programmer, you would have realized that some things you type sort of get highlighted in this fashion. Things like if, things like print, things like for. They all have their fonts change it to either italics or just a different color in general. Now, what does this mean? This means that it is a Python keyword, basically signifying that, hey, this keyword has a different meaning, so you wouldn't want to include for as a variable name. And what is a variable? I'll talk about that later as well. There are many more Python keywords that you'll run into, and if you'll know it if it's a different color. So if it's a different color, it might be a smart thing not to initialize that as a variable. So what is a Python variable? A variable is simply a name that's assigned to a value. For example, let's say here, just making a tag. Let's say here we want to say hello world, and then our value here is that string that we wrote at the start, hello world exclamation mark. Then we can make that print function again. However, instead of putting this into it, we're gonna put that hello world variable into it. And what will this do? You can all have your own predictions. However, there's only one right answer, and that will just output the contents of that variable. Exactly just as what we wrote before up in the earlier parts of the video. It's just a name that's associated with a piece of data. So these can be numbers, things like 1 or 2 or 999. It doesn't really matter. It can be a number. It can be a name, like we just said, like Danny, for example. It can be pretty much anything, any piece of data. We're just going to initialize to 0 for now. One important thing to note about variables is that they are mutable. What does mutable mean? It means that you can change them during runtime. They're not a fixed thing. So yeah, that's pretty much just what I wanted to say. And how can we assign a variable? If you have some sort of intuition for programming, you would have already realized that we assign our variable names to data using this equals operator. This equals operator just says, hey, I want to assign everything before the equals operator to everything after the equals operator. All this data after I want to assign to this name here. If that's clear, great. If it isn't, go back and keep rewatching till it is clear. Python does not care about anything you put after it as long as it is a type of data. So what is and something I would like to mention is that data type names, variables cannot have spaces. So you can't make a variable data type something like this. You'd have to do data underscore type or data type, something like that. You can't have spaces in your variable names. It's just it'll confuse the computers. They don't know what to do with it. So yeah, just a warning there. If you do get those types of errors, make sure you look at your console log. And just to show you that that doesn't work, let's say variable 1 and we assign that to, let's say, 0. If we try and run our program here, we do get an error and it says invalid syntax, and that's simply just because of the fact that we have a space in our variable. And now if we remove that space, make it a little bit more readable, and we print it out, great, everything works out. So yeah, that's just a little fun fact I thought I'd tell you guys. Next up, what are data types? So this will be more of a significant issue to talk about once we get onto Java, but it's good to briefly go over some data types. So some data types you may encounter are integers. So let's just write that out. An integer, yes, what a mouthful. And that's just numbers, pretty much. Just another way of saying numbers, and like 45, just an integer. And then we've already had some experience with this. String. What is a string? It's just a sentence, a word, a letter, everything you want. Now, a string of length 1 is defined as a character. However, that's not something you really need to know now. It's just something you might want to keep in your mind while coding, I guess. It's just things like Danny, names, things like hello world, short segments of sentences, things like that. Next, we have a float. What is a float? Literally just a decimal, like 12.1, 6.5, 5.5, things like that. Pretty simple. Next up, we have a Boolean value. What is a Boolean? Things like true, things like false, basically signifying whether it's off or on, things like that. True or false values. We'll get more to this later. Booleans will become a huge part of programming, so learning them and how they work is completely essential. Next up, I'm sure you've already seen me do this and have wondered what they are. We have this hashtag operator followed with just anything pretty much. It's literally just commenting. It's anything, it's arbitrary. It's anything you want to write to make your code more readable. When your computer that's processing this reads or passes over a line with a hashtag, what they say is, hey, don't look at this. It might as well just be this saying to the computer. The computer completely ignores this and it doesn't process what this could mean at all. So these are used for, let's say, taking out code that you don't want your computer to look at straight away. For example, let's say I want print hello, and as well as that I have print goodbye. I don't really want my computer, I don't really want my computer to print out the hello and goodbye. So as you see, when I print this out, it prints the hello and goodbye, but I don't want it to print the goodbye yet. So I'll highlight this line here, and I will just comment it out by putting a hashtag at the front of it. And then we run this code, and what happens, it doesn't look at the hashtag line. So that's what commenting is for you. It's pretty simple stuff. You should be able to get it by now. If you haven't, then just look over, fast forward back in the video and keep rewatching. Next up, we have Python calculations. They're an intuitive matter, to say the least, with the usual math operators defined as, let's just give you examples. So we have basic addition. So add 1, I'm just gonna say it's like 1 plus 1. If we print that out now, let's say we print add 1, what's gonna happen? Well, you guessed it, it's gonna print out 1 plus 1, which is actually 2. Now let's make another variable here and let's call it sub1, 1 minus 1. Oh, hey guys, what's that gonna output? Yes, you guessed it, it's gonna output 0. This is pretty intuitive for the rest of the operators, but I am gonna give you examples of these just in case you're a little bit slow with it. So multiplication 1 is 1 times 2, just for this manner. So if you're familiar with mathematics, you know that 1 you know that 1 times 2 is actually 2, and we get that output here. In case you didn't see, let me just go back to that. We get the output as 2. Yep, next up we have division. Now you're gonna see something interesting occur here. So let's say we divide 2 by 2. What value are we gonna get from that? Yes, obviously 1. However, when we tell this print function to output division 1, what actually happens is it prints 1.0. Now you might be thinking, hey, that's not that big of a deal, but it's just sort of to show you that some of the internal workings aren't what you think they are. As I told you before, a float is something with decimal values, right? So we're putting 2 integers, 2 numbers in, and it's outputting a float. That's just something interesting. You might want to sort of start looking into some sort of curious, abstraction. So you might want to look at abstraction. You don't really need to know what that is now or why this function outputs a float, but just in case you want to get ahead of the curve, look into it. It's pretty interesting to see how that sort of works out. Next, we're gonna be looking at exponents. And we show an exponent, which is sort of different from in your basic mathematics. We show an exponent with a double star sign here. So if we do 2 to the power of 2, we're obviously going to get out a 4 here. So let's print that out here, and we do get a 4. If we do 3, we should get a value of 8. And yes, we do, showing that this works. And lastly, a very important operator that you're going to be using is actually the operator modulus. So what this modulus does is it just returns the remainder of dividing one value by another. So let's say you divide 5 by 2, it's going to say hey, 2 fits into 5 two times, but I don't really know what to do with this last one. So it's going to output that remainder value here. So let's say 5 modulus 2. If I print that out again, it is gonna output that one value. Let's change that up 3. And if we do 5 modulus 3, it's gonna say, hey, 3 fits in here one time, but I don't know what to do with these last two values. So let's just make sure that works. And yes, it does. Now, what would happen if we do 5 modulus 5? Well, you guessed it. It's going to output a value of 0. It's going to say, hey, 5 fits into 5 perfectly one time. We don't have any remainders, nothing of that of the sort. So, hey, just take a 0. So you can sort of see how this might come in handy in problems in the future. Okay, guys, that's the end of Python Fundamentals Part 1. And I like to finish all of my videos with just a quick practice problem. So I have a practice problem here prepared for you guys. And yeah, see if you guys can do it. So the practice problem is as such. Write a program that calculates the GPA given a series of grades. Manually assign the grades as follows and calculate the average. Save it to a variable called AVG and print out the average to the shell. Okay, so how would we go about this? First off, it tells us to manually assign the grade. So we're just going to say grade 1 is equal to 4 out of 7, for example. Grade 2 is equal to 5 out of 7. And grade 3 is equal to 7 out of 7. Okay, and in sum calculations, we're just going to say our sum here is equal to grade 1 plus grade 2 plus grade 3. Okay, now if you're familiar with averaging, the average formula is sum divided by number of terms in the sum. So we're going to do our average. It's told us to assign it to a variable called avg dot. We're going to say avg dot, and dot is actually something that we can't use, so we're just going to say avg is equal to sum divided by divided by 4, let's say. Now when we print out this value, when we print out this value of avg, what do we get here? Let's see. We get a value of 4.0. Now that's quite interesting. Let's see if we change the grade here to a 6 out of 7. What are we gonna get? Nuts. We get our averaging. So if we sort of do this intuitively, we change it back to a 7. A 7 plus 5 is 12 plus 4 is 16. Now divide 16 by 4 and we get a value of 4. Now let's just print that again to check if it's right. And yes, it is right. Okay, guys, that is the end of Python Fundamentals Part 1. I hope you guys enjoyed, and make sure to look at my other videos. Have a great one.